Welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's really good to have you with us. This week, we are exploring Matthew's account of the Transfiguration as we get ready to enter once again into the season of Lent. Before we begin exploring that, however, if you've not done so already, you might find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study. You can find the link for it in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet, you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so then, without any further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17, verses 1 to 9. Jesus had once again been followed around by huge crowds whose ailments he was curing. And then we learned that he had fed at least 4,000 people, 4,000 men plus the women and children who happened to be there, on a mountainside near the Sea of Galilee. That's in chapter 15, verses 29 to 39. After some conflict with both Pharisees and Sadducees, which is interesting because they didn't tend to get on, as documented in chapter 16, verses 1 to 4, and his warning to his disciples about being wary of their teaching and their traps in chapter 16, verses 5 to 12. Jesus had then moved on to the content that immediately precedes today's reading, in that he had asked his disciples who people say that he was, and then asked them, indeed, who did they say that he was? And that covers chapter 16, verses 13 to 20. Now, after this discussion, and when Peter had declared Jesus to be the Messiah, he taught them that the Son of Man must suffer and die before rising again, and that being his disciple would mean being willing to deny oneself, take up the cross, and follow him. As we read in verses 21 to 28. And we know in that section that Peter found this really difficult to deal with and found himself being rebuked and put in his place by Jesus. So, a lot has happened in the run-up to today's passage, which very much sets the scene for it, and it's kind of the pivot point in Matthew's Gospel, in that the action from this point will turn very much towards Jerusalem and the crucifixion. Today's passage, we're told, narrates events that occurred 6 days after that episode with Peter, and up a mountain that we can't be certain about, but was likely either Mount Hermon or Mount Tabor. And that invites us to look at Mark chapter 9, verse 2, and Luke chapter 9, verse 28 for a point of comparison. So we have quite a few different figures in this scene. We have Jesus, very obviously, as I say, at the turning point of his public ministry, when things are going to move away from Galilee and turn towards Jerusalem. And it's arguable that the feeding of the 4,000 was kind of the culmination, if you will, of Jesus's Galilean ministry. And then we get into this preparatory, sort of transitional chapter in chapter 16. Peter, James and John were the 3 disciples who were taken up the Mount of Transfiguration. They were 3 of Jesus' closest friends, and they were among, as Matthew tells it us, the first 4 disciples to be called. We learned that in chapter 4, verses 18 to 25. The other member of that quartet, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was not taken up the Mount of Transfiguration. We also have 2 figures that appear to Jesus, with Jesus in that scene. Firstly, we got Moses, who was the one who gave the law to the people of Israel and was their great liberator from slavery, captivity, oppression in Egypt. His burial place, as we learn in Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 6, wasn't actually known. And we also have Elijah, who was the greatest of the Hebrew prophets, and we're told that he did not die, but he was carried up to heaven in a fiery chariot. And both these figures appear alongside Jesus and speak with him in today's miraculous scene. Now, Matthew's Gospel was the second of the canonical Gospels to be written, likely around 75 to 80 of the Common Era. It therefore was written after the Jerusalem temple had been destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, and that's key in shaping a lot of how Matthew presents things as the people of Israel are figuring out what their identity now looks like after that. And also, this is the Gospel that's most overtly grounded in the mindset and framework of what's become known as Second Temple Judaism. It's the most overtly Jewish of the Synoptic Gospels. Now, this narrative of the Transfiguration draws very much on symbolism from the Hebrew Scriptures. I would argue very much trying to cast Jesus as both the new Moses and also the one who is fulfilling the great prophetic tradition. So, it's helpful also to take a look at, for example, Exodus chapter 34 verses 29 to 35, that show us that Moses, when he descended from Mount Sinai, having been given the law by Yahweh, had a face that also shone dazzling white. We may want to look at 2 Kings chapter 2 verses 1 to 12, which show us this story of Elijah being carried off to heaven and handing the prophetic baton onto his disciple Elisha. And it's also interesting to compare today's account with those in the other synoptic gospels, so in Mark chapter 9 verses 2 to 9 and in Luke chapter 9 verses 28 through to 36. So the Transfiguration, among the many other things it does, I think sets out the purpose of following Jesus and tells us an awful lot about who he is and where following him leads. It's a kind of foreshadowing of the glory of resurrection in a context where we've had prediction of Jesus' passion, and we also have something that's there to encourage and sustain his disciples. And Peter, after that episode of being told to get behind me and being rebuked, I think really would have needed that encouragement and reassurance. Now, Matthew tells us that the events of the Transfiguration occurred 6 days after Peter had declared Jesus to be the Messiah. Learn that in verse 1. And the timing is significant. Mark follows Matthew in Mark chapter 9 verse 2 in telling us it was 6 days later. Luke, in Luke 9 verse 28, tells us it was 8 days later, and that was likely to do with symbolism around circumcision. But the 6-day period that Mark has and Matthew seems to follow reflects the time that Moses and Joshua spent up on Mount Sinai before being given the words of the covenant. And we can find that story in Exodus chapter 24 verses 13 to 18. So there's something here once again about Jesus fulfilling the law and the prophets as symbolized by Moses and Elijah respectively. Now, mountains were, as we've noted in previous weeks as we've been exploring the Sermon on the Mount, traditionally places of encounter with God. And Jesus had gone there to pray, we learn in verse 1, as was often his practice. And that might remind us also, for example, of Exodus chapter 19, verses 16 to 19, and chapter 20, verses 1 to 17. We might also look to 1 Kings chapter 19 verses 11 to 30 to see Elijah going up a mountain and turning to God in his moment of need. We don't learn the exact location, as I've already noted. And it's interesting that Matthew doesn't tell us, looking back to chapter 5 verses 1 and 2, for example, where the Sermon on the Mount took place. So precise location isn't as important as the general backdrop, general setting. Now, in verse 2, we're told that while Jesus was praying, his face became other, heteros, to literally translate the Greek, the same word that's used in Luke 9, verse 29. And his clothes became dazzling white. Now that links back to the imagery in Daniel 7, verse 9, and may also recall the Exodus 34. But it also, in this being a foretaste of the resurrection, looks ahead to the appearance of those figures who will tell the women who come to the empty tomb that Christ was not there, that he is risen. And we look to chapter 28, verse 3 of Matthew's Gospel for that. Now, it's traditionally been argued that Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus, as noted in verse 3, because they represent both the law and the prophets, and their returns are seen as pointing towards the coming of the Messiah. And we might look to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, or Malachi chapter 4, verse 5, for example, to see that about Moses and Elijah, respectively. Peter, it seems, wanted to prolong that moment. And so in verse 4, he offers to build 3 booths, 3 tabernacles, looking perhaps to the symbolism of the Feast of Tabernacles, for each of those 3 figures, recalling therefore God's wilderness protection with the people of Israel, taking us to Leviticus 23, verses 39 to 43. And he wants to build one for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for Jesus. He wanted, it seems, to remain in that mountain place. He wanted to prolong the moment and would get something of a shock. He was still speaking, still saying this, when the cloud descended, again very much in the imagery of Exodus. The cloud in verse 5 depicts the glory and the presence of God, Shekinah, as seen in Exodus 13, verse 21, when Israel wandered in the wilderness. And the voice in the cloud, which talks of Jesus as God's beloved Son, resonates with what we heard right at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel in chapter 3, verses 13 to 17, when Jesus' baptism was described. That affirmation was given there to Jesus. On this occasion, the disciples, Peter, James, and John, can hear it too. And it echoes the theophany, the divine speech and action of Exodus chapters 19 and 20. So again, it's another instance of this connection with Jesus and Moses that is laid bare for us in the Transfiguration. Unsurprisingly, Peter, James, and John were terrified. They fell down and prostrated themselves in a posture of worship, as we learn in verse 6. And they were scared in response to the heavenly voice. But Jesus tells them not to be afraid in verse 7, and he touches them. Both the words and the gesture are gestures of comfort, gestures of peace. And we can see other references to that in chapter 8, verses 3 and 15, chapter 9, verse 29, and chapter 20, verse 34. This note of comfort, I think, brings us back to the theme of encouragement of those 3 disciples, particularly Peter after that previous very difficult incident. It was a reminder that God would be with them, whatever would come next. And as we know, the action is decisively turning towards Jerusalem. We know that that coming next will shortly be crucifixion. As soon as all of this had happened, however, verse 8 tells us everything went back to normal, and it was just Jesus with the 3 friends once again. Verse 9, leading into their coming down from the mountain, tells us that they were sworn to secrecy. They were not to reveal what had happened on the Mount of Transfiguration until after the Son of Man, to use Jesus' favourite title for himself, had been raised up from the dead. Now that's the same dynamic that we find in Mark's account of this incident. It's notable that in Luke, the disciples almost decide to silence themselves by choosing to keep quiet until after the resurrection, as we learn in Luke 9, verse 36. But it seems that Matthew is keen to follow Mark in making the point that it was only really right to speak of this after the resurrection, which these events on the Mount of Transfiguration were foreshadowing. So, we have got an awful lot going on here. We've got Jesus taking on the baton from Moses and Elijah. We've got Jesus very much being cast as the new Moses, the new liberator. We've got comfort and encouragement for frightened, bewildered, perhaps rather hurt in Peter's case, disciples. And we've also got a sense of what is to come in terms of both the cross and the resurrection. So there's an awful lot to be thinking about as we now dive into our questions for this week.